This will be fun. So, it's interesting to me that God would have it set up so that a message on something as important as his promises would be the message that I would have to preach without notes. Find that very interesting. And I believe that God's sovereignty is over top of all things. And so we'll see what he does this morning. I'm convinced that he will be at work through his word no matter what. Okay? You ready to take that journey with me? Okay. Does everything in your life happen exactly the way that you think it should? No. All right? So now you get to see it on display up front. Today's message is the reality of what it is to be blessed, kingdom living in an upside-down world. We're going to look at the reality of what it is to keep promises. Nate, grab my Bible for me. I don't have notes, but I can at least have that. Right? Thank you, sir. Great way to start out this morning, right? Keeping promises. Open up to Matthew chapter 5. Verses 27 to 30. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 30. Verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except from the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you've heard it was said of those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven or the throne of God, or by the earth, or its footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So there's 2 points today. As you see in your notes, there's 2 points today. The first that we're going to look at brings this up. What is that? A butterfly. And many of you have heard the illustration of the little boy who found the caterpillar and put it in the jar and got really excited but couldn't wait to see the butterfly. So he waited for a little while, and the caterpillar was developing in the cocoon into a butterfly. And what did the little boy do? He couldn't wait, so what did he do? He pried open the cocoon to let the butterfly out. Now the butterfly came out and it looked pretty, but what was the problem? It couldn't fly. Why couldn't it fly? Because it actually needed the struggle that it takes to get out of that cocoon to be able to fly. The little boy, by trying to help the caterpillar, actually hurt the caterpillar, hurt the butterfly, because it did not actually get do insects have blood in the same way we have blood? But it was not able to get out to those extremities to be able to use his wings. The idea of marriage is one of those things that for anybody who's been married any length of time, or anybody who's seen someone be married for any length of time, which is most of us in this room, you realize marriage is not always particularly easy. No laugh, nothing? How many of you can attest that as much as you love the person that you're probably sitting next to right now, they are not always a picnic to be married to? Right? Yeah, there you go. Okay. All right, we have some honesty here. And how many of you also would come to the place to admit that the person that your spouse is married to is also not always a picnic to live with. All right, okay, more honesty there. This is good. And we know this too from, even if you're not married, you know this from relationships. We live in a fallen world. It's a fallen humanity. And relationships are difficult. Well, in the midst of what Jesus is discussing here, he goes right at the reality of divorce. You've heard it said that you should just give a certificate of divorce. And I want to title this part of it, Tragically Missing the Point. Right? It's verse 31 and 32. Jesus begins here in verse 31, right? Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. That's what it has been said. Now that has backup in the Old Testament scriptures that was part of what the case was. But he says, I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now in my notes, I have all of the detailed realities of when divorce is, when it's not, and I can wrestle through those with you quickly, right? There's really only 3 ways out of a marriage. They all begin with D, so it's very helpful that I made them all begin with D. Death, okay, right? That's one. Out of marriage because of death. Divorce on biblically sound reasons, right? In here, right? We have sexual immorality. Any sort of sexual activity outside of marriage, a spouse is allowed, if they want to pursue that divorce. And third, desertion. And that would be in 1 Corinthians 7. I've really tested my memory here, right? And the reality is, if an unbelieving spouse leaves, then you are free from that marriage. They seek that divorce by leaving, you're free. So again, if you want to talk to me more when things are back in the right spot in my head and in my notes, let's talk about that. But I want you to think for a second about what marriage, how marriage is and how it was. I think that if you were to turn, let's turn to Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. I think this will give us a little bit of a feeling for it. Matthew chapter 19. Verse 3. The Pharisees came up to him, that being Jesus, and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Did you see how broad the Pharisees are being? They're trying to trap Jesus. Is it okay to divorce for any cause? And the reality, the sad reality is of what marriages were and what they had become at that point in Jesus' ministry is that any cause would do. Right? In fact, the Jewish writings at the time said that if a wife spoiled a dinner, divorce would be fine. Just hand her a certificate of divorce. Right? Then she would be free to find somebody else and marry, and everything would be fine, right? Or if he found anything displeasing in his sight. That's what the Jewish writing at the time, that's what the rabbis had in writing at the time. So they come up and ask Jesus, are you going to go against what the rabbis have said? And what's he say? He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And they said to him, well, why then did Moses give the command to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, this was not so. You see how Jesus responds? We're in essence, we're coming in even to the middle of a conversation. What was happening is that marriage became like that disposable cup that I talked about a few weeks ago. It became a thing that you could take or leave. And if it frustrated you that your wife or your husband did something, right? The husband, generally speaking, was the one to initiate these things. But that's what it had become. You've heard it said, if you want a divorce, just give her a piece of paper. Then she's free, you're free, everybody's happy. But are they? The reality of marriage is supposed to point to something much, much deeper than what they in their time and us in our time think marriage is about. Are there escape hatches? We already talked about that a bit. But look again at Matthew chapter 5, right? Verse 32. I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, there are intricacies to this passage that I am not comfortable talking about without my notes. But that is up to the Lord right now, okay? We could talk about that later, about the intricacies of that, what that means and what that does not mean as far as that goes. What he's saying, in essence, is if you are a husband who just gives your wife a certificate of divorce because she burnt supper, you're causing her to commit adultery. Because that's not a valid reason in God's eyes to pursue a divorce. Period. It's just not. And anything short of what it says here, sexual immorality, is not a valid reason. Right? Now, I understand that I'm speaking to a crowd of people who have very different experiences of this and realities of this. And I don't want to be insensitive to that. My own parents were divorced when I was in kindergarten. Okay, so I know the realities of it. I know them very, very deeply. Both of my parents remarried shortly after they were divorced. And one of the realities is that God does see those next marriages as marriages. Okay? So even if those things had not been done in all those ways according to what God has said, when you remarry, that marriage is a marriage. Okay? Again, without my notes, I'm not going to go much further than saying that. Let's talk afterward if you need more clarification there. But here's the reality. When we seek escape hatches to marriage, when we look for reasons to get out of it, we short circuit what God is up to. Because it is actually the promise, the commitment that you make, the covenant that you enter into, that gives you the standing by which God works to transform you. How many of you know this to be true? The fact that you ought not try to get out of difficult relationships has actually done more to sanctify you than if you were to try to disappear from them. Right? God's intention for marriage, his intention is that two sinful, self-centered people come together and through that realize how sinful and self-centered they are. And God is at work in sanctifying them because of that. I hope that in your marriages, those of you who are married, I hope that you start to see that what God is doing in and through your marriage is not working so that you would be fulfilled through the other person and because of the other person. What I hope that you start seeing is that living with another person causes you to find fulfillment in the only place it really is, in Jesus Christ. And that your relationship with that other person actually drives you to find and seek satisfaction in Jesus. And then what happens? As both of you begin to be transformed, what happens to your marriage? It gets really, really satisfying. It gets really, really good. To the extent that you resist God's sanctifying work in your marriage, or, can I submit to you, those of you who are single and not married, to the extent that you resist the sanctifying work of having to deal with other people, you miss that chance to be transformed. You miss that chance to become more and more and more the person that God has intended you to be. And then, how many of you know that if marriage isn't one thing, then you have kids? And the sanctifying work, what? Starts all over again. Because then you see, oh, I'm actually to blame for my kids being somewhat the way they are. I see myself in them. They've inherited a sinfulness from me that now I get to see displayed back to me. And what should that do? Not do what I say, not as I do. But both of us coming to the realization we both need God's help, don't we? Let's seek that together. So God's intention, the point of marriage, if you make it the point that God's only intention for me in my marriage is to not get divorced, see how shallow and small that is? What is God's intention? That you be sanctified. Those of you who I've been able to meet with and do premarital counseling with, you can attest to this reality that I've told you numerous times. Marriage without Jesus at the center, as the point of marriage and the fulfillment of marriage, is like 2 ticks and no dog. It's 2 ticks and no dog. Are you putting the pieces together? You're going to suck each other dry because you don't have what it takes to fulfill the other person. Jesus has what it takes to fulfill you and your spouse, and that is how you build a faithful, healthy marriage. Otherwise, you're going to be looking to them to fulfill all that you need and want. 2 ticks, no dog. You're going to suck each other dry. You're going to try to draw from the other person identity and strength and joy when that was never the point. The point of marriage is that both of you come to the realization that you both need the all-satisfying reality of Jesus Christ. And out of that, you're sanctified. And out of that, you then become the kind of person that the other person can rely on, that the other person can look to and see Jesus in you. But it's still ultimately Christ. Okay? You've heard it said, do whatever you can to not get a divorce. Or look for these escape hatches. Or just write a certificate of divorce. You've heard it said that that's how marriage is supposed to be. But I tell you, Jesus says, I tell you, there's more going on here. You're entering into this one flesh union because God intends to sanctify you through it. Make sense? Second point. We'll move on to this next part of this passage. Oaths, boasting, and nothing to prove. Listen into verse 33. Again, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head. You cannot make one hair white or black. Can I get an amen? Anybody out there? Hair dye only does so much. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil. What do we see here? When we look at verse 33, we see What was it said of oaths? Right? You've heard it was said of those of old, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." Right? The combination of the commandment to not bear false testimony, but also that when you make an oath, it matters. Jesus is not dismissing that, but he's saying all the more you need to understand something else. What is it that we need to understand? Well, you need to understand that what Jesus is saying comes in the middle of a conversation. You ever come into the middle of a conversation and everybody gets silent? It's likely because they're talking about you, right? Or something they don't want you to hear about. But this is like coming in the middle of a conversation. Middle of a conversation, there's stuff that's happened before that you didn't hear, and there's stuff that they're talking about currently that you're not fully understanding, so that wherever they go for a conclusion, you might not end up in the same place. They come into the middle of a conversation, and you can see it in the way that this passage is set up. Notice there, "I say to you, do not take an oath at all." And notice the things that they were taking an oath by, that they were swearing by. Swearing by heaven, the throne of God. Swearing by earth, its footstool. Swearing by Jerusalem, right, the city of the great king. Swearing by their own head. And what Jesus is saying is, doing that, making oaths, swearing, making it a big deal that you're trying to prove to the person. Why do you swear towards some or on something, right? You know the feeling of being on the playground, right? I swear on my mother's grave, right? For instance, it's pretty serious, right? And if your mother's at home making supper, getting ready for you to come home after recess, she doesn't know you just swore by her or her death, right? Which is not good. But what is the kid on the playground trying to do? They're trying to bolster the fact that what they're saying is true, trying to prove it to be true, right? Another conversation right on the playground, right? My dad's bigger than your dad. My dad can lift a car. Well, my dad can lift a truck. Well, my dad can lift a boat. Right? You've been there recently? I have. Yeah. The reality is that they were trying to swear upon things or take oaths on things that were bigger than themselves to try to prove their point. And what does that reveal? What does that reveal? It reveals that they do not have the actual character in and of themselves. That their words might be counted as trustworthy. Notice here again in the end of this verse. What's it say? Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil. Anything more than that causes you to believe that you're in fact able in a way that you are not. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Let what you say, let the character of who you are be plenty to prove your words to be true. Right? That's what Jesus is saying. Don't look to all these other things and borrow from God's creation and his city and his temple and his throne. Don't do that. Be the kind of person who can be trusted, who can be believed. Your simple yes or no is enough. Because ultimately what it shows, God's intention for you is that you actually have nothing to prove. You don't need to root your identity in something like that. You don't need to root how people think of you and go to greater and greater and greater extents to prop yourself up. You need to look to God to transform you, to be the kind of person who, when you say something, people know that it is the truth. That's what Jesus is pushing at. Don't swear by these other things to try and bolster your case. Be transformed in such a way that when you say something, it has weight on its own. You don't have to add anything to it. There's so much more that I know that I would have said. But let's think about what we do with this. First of all, I think we need to acknowledge the fallenness of where we are. We need to acknowledge that we are tempted, just like others in previous generations, to see the standard and then work to lower the standard so that we can reach it. And I've told you before, what does that do? Lowering the standard actually kills transformation, right? Because if you lower the standard and you can actually meet that standard, you don't need to be transformed by God in the first place. So when you lower the standard, acknowledge the fallenness of where we really are. When we lower the standard of what it is to be in marriage as, well, at least we're not divorced. How sad is that? I'm not saying it's not a reality in many marriages. It sadly is a reality in many marriages. And it's because we've lowered that standard. When really what God is intending for us is joy and satisfaction and purpose and representing Him and proclaiming the gospel through being married or through your singleness, right? His intention is that the bar is that high. So acknowledge your fallenness. Acknowledge how much you've let your mind fall from that reality so that you can say, God, I need you to transform me. So you can admit the ways that you try to do it without seeking God, looking to God, asking Him to be at work in your heart to transform you. All the ways that we do that, whether it be by the things that we take oaths upon or the things that we do in our marriages, in what ways are you trying to make those things happen without God transforming you? Through the power of His Spirit, through the power of the gospel, through the power of His Word. What ways are you trying to make it happen without transformation? And it's going to show itself in those ways that you go to great extents to try and prove yourself true or prove yourself right. Or it shows itself in the ways that you lower the standard, maybe when it comes to marriage or truth, right? Those things are supposed to be markers to tell us, man, I'm trying to go run an end run around being transformed when I really need to look to Christ. And lastly, look to Him. Again, we all have a little Pharisee in our head that says to us, you fell short of God's standard, so do what you need to do to fix it, and then go to God. That little Pharisee in your head is saying that. And you need to not only ignore him, but push him out of your mind by the Spirit and say, no, I need to go to God to fix this. That's really my only hope. So again, I would look at whatever it be, your marriage, your relationships with others in your life. What are you resisting? What are you resisting God doing in you? Don't lower that standard. Look to God for the transformation that you need to actually meet that standard. And that's going to be by giving up all of your self-salvation projects to try and make it to where you think He wants you to be, and putting yourself in the place where you say, I am in need, God, of your grace and your help for whatever it is that I face. Okay? I'm going to invite our worship team up. And one of the realities that we face is that it is easy for us to take lightly our promises, whether that be marriage or any other promise that we make. And if we think that it all depends on us to keep our promises, we're looking for the wrong source of strength. When we see God's faithfulness to keep his promises, when we see his faithfulness, his character to keep his promises, and we lean into that, how much easier is it for us then to say, you know what, with that kind of help, with that kind of power, with that kind of transformation, I can keep my marriage vows. And more than that, I can thrive in them. With that kind of faithfulness, I can resist sexual immorality because he is that kind of powerful, that kind of good, that kind of willing to transform me. With that kind of God, I can resist trying to bolster my case through lies or deception because he's that kind of faithful. I don't need to. I can just lean in to him. So guys, lead us in reminding how God keeps his promises.